with the advent of the third military spring, fate has delivered its verdict. The stakes are stacked. The scales had tipped. In the United States, vast resources have been turned into means of warfare. Russia has risen. Stalingrad will tell the world. England managed to restore its position in Egypt. Fighting France was building up its forces in France and beyond. The resistance of oppressed peoples, especially Poles, Yugoslavs, Greeks, became a tangible factor in the war. In conditions when the forces of Germany at the limit, Italy demoralized, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Turkey firmly hold the position of neutrality, in the Pacific slowed down the military advance of Japan and strengthened the defense of China. In these circumstances, everything prompts the Allies to move from passive defense to strike. In the West, a military operation of wide scope is being prepared. I see it brewing, feeling a certain emptiness around me compared to partners who cannot complain of loneliness. A poor man among the rich. I am full of hope, but overcome by worries. Indeed, in the centre of the planned operation, one way or another, will be France. For us, it is not only a question of expelling the enemy from French territory, but also of the future of France as a nation and as a state. If she remains exhausted, it will mean the end of her faith in herself and thus the end of her independence. She will slip from the silence of the sea to an incurable paralysis, from slavery imposed by the enemy to submission to her allies. Conversely, if it regains its unity and takes its place in the common order, nothing is lost. And this time the future may yet be saved, provided that by the time the last act of the drama is played out, France will be a belligerent France, rallied around a single authority. What power? Clearly, it could be the Vichy regime. In the eyes of the French people and the world, Vichy symbolizes the acceptance of catastrophe. Whatever the circumstances that explain the delusions of this regime, their very depth is such that the Vichy government will be forced to persevere, if only to obey the demon of despair. Of course, one or another of the Vichy rulers, having disassociated himself from it, may yet play an occasional role. But it will be difficult to convince anyone that this belated repentance is not dictated by mere calculation, a concession to circumstances. Of course, a major military figure can, by calling the army to a fair fight, enthuse the professional military, who in their hearts are just waiting for such a call. But such an initiative will change nothing in the people themselves, because the state of mind has already been determined. Nor is there the slightest chance that in a national disaster the masses will turn their aspirations, their faith to the political regime that has recently been swept away by the catastrophe. This is best understood by the very people who were the most characteristic representatives of that regime. Some of them joined the Vichyists, many joined de Gaulle. There are some who have not yet made up their minds, but it does not occur to any of them to take the helm of the ship of the past. But there is a Communist Party. Ever since Hitler invaded Russia, the Communist Party has stood as the champion of war. This party, without regard to sacrifice, takes part in the resistance movement, recalls the troubles experienced by France and the people's grief, tries to fuse national revolt and social revolution into a single liberating force, and claims the halo of the savior of society. Possessing an organization that is not held back by any doubts and not stopped by any disagreements, splendidly able to dissolve other forces and to use all vocabularies, this party would like to appear as a force capable of securing some order on the day when a wave of anarchy may sweep over the country. And besides, would not this party be able to offer France, humiliated France, the active help of Russia, the most powerful power in Europe? Thus, the Communist Party expects that the collapse of the Vichy regime will give it an opportunity to establish a dictatorship in our country. That's true. But this calculation will be in vain if the state is reconstituted in another way, if the French give their sympathies to the national government, if its head, in the illumination of victory, suddenly appears in Paris. Here is my task: to regroup the French forces in the war, to rid France of the dangers of a communist coup, to make her fate once more depend on herself. Yesterday, the actions of a bunch of Frenchmen on the battlefields were enough to meet events in full force. Tomorrow it will be a question of such a central power as the country will follow and welcome. For me in this phase, it will no longer be a question of throwing one force or another into the fire of the struggle, of reuniting here and there scraps of territory, of singing hymns in honor of the greatness of the French nation. I will need to unite the French people as they are, against the enemy, against the Allies, despite terrible internal strife, I will have to rebuild the unity of a torn France. My insistence on tearing away the veil of secrecy behind which the Americans and British concealed their intentions during the interlude is understandable. In reality, the initiative in the decisions belonged to the United States, for henceforth the main effort fell to them. In Washington, the President, the ministers, and the leading figures henceforth felt themselves to be the heads of the coalition. Their tone and their demeanour made this quite clear. Forward units of the American Army, Air Force, Navy were arriving in Britain and settling in British bases and military camps. Streets, stores, movie theatres, pubs of London were swarming with Yanks in military uniforms, such good-natured and unceremonious guys. The Commander-in-Chief of the American forces, General Eisenhower, General Clark, Admiral Stark, General Spaatz, respectively commanding the land, sea and air forces of the United States in Europe, flaunted the new and needle-tailored equipment of their headquarters against the background of the traditional machine of the British War Ministry, the Maritime Ministry, the Royal Air Force. The English, in spite of all their composure, could not conceal a certain sadness, which was caused by the consciousness that they were no longer masters in their own house, and that they had lost the first role which for the past 2 years they had played, and worthily played, in the current war. I will not hide the fact that watching the British go in tow with the aliens, I felt a certain uneasiness. Justice demands that it should be noted that, both in the social milieu and in the governing circles, one could observe many people who had not without difficulty adapted themselves to this generally dependent position. Such was the case, for example, in the Furian office. But the Lend-Lease supplies, by their crushing weight, restrained these impulses of independence. Churchill himself, whether for tactical or emotional reasons, decided henceforth to be only Roosevelt's lieutenant, given that France could not play its traditional role of inspirer of the Old World, this self-exclusion of England, which despite its island position was closely tied to the European mainland, did not bode well for the future when European affairs were finally decided. At that moment, the Americans were still hesitating in the choice of their strategy. 2 different concepts possessed the minds of Roosevelt and his advisers. At times, yielding to the pressure of national dynamism, which continued with magnificent efforts in armament and organization, Washington cherished plans for an early landing. All the more so because the Russians, who had suffered a hellish ordeal under the pressure of the German armies, were loudly demanding the opening of a second front. The persistence of the Russians impressed the British and Americans, who were secretly worried, considering the possibility of a sudden turn of Moscow. Whatever the secret plans of the American leaders, we still knew that they were preparing an operation aimed at creating a pre-bridge fortification in France by the end of the year. But America, while cherishing bold plans, was at the same time listening to the voice of caution, also considered a plan to land in North Africa so that decisive strikes on the European mainland were postponed to a later date. After all, American troops were to be drawn into hostilities on the other side of the Atlantic, and US leaders really had great concerns. For the first time in history, Americans were to lead major military operations. Even in the years of the First World military clash, more or less significant American troops appeared on the battlefields only in the last operations, and even then as auxiliary forces and, so to speak, in the order of subordination to others. It is true that since 1939, the US firmly decided that it must create military power. But while the American Navy, at that time already the strongest in the world, could easily take into service any number of ships and airplanes that would be given to it, the case was different with the land and air forces. They had only just emerged from their infancy, and it took some time for them to adapt to operations of such enormous scope. That is why, although in the military camps formed in serial order at the insistence of General Marshall numerous divisions in the Pentagon, just organized, fearfully pondered how to behave face-to-face with the Wehrmacht hastily organized divisions, which had some trained personnel and very diverse in its composition of staffs. On the eve of the performance showed a tendency to act only gradually and in successive stages, especially since the British for their part were not inclined to rush events. Forced to give up the role of leaders, they wanted to ensure that the victory, if it is not mainly their victory, at least not cost too much. By pushing back the timing of decisive battles, time could be bought while American armies accumulated and British forces could be saved. In addition, London, seeing how the American armaments are growing, expected that the material superiority which already had the Allies will become tangible in 1943 and overwhelming in 1944. Besides, Why take unnecessary risks and perhaps go to a new Dunkirk, while on the Russian front every day more and more exhausted enemy forces? In addition, the bombardment of German cities by British aircraft and US air squadrons were beginning to seriously interfere with the industry of Hitler's Germany, while German aviation very rarely attacked England. Finally, American cargo and convoy ships came into action, which solved the transportation question. To this we must add that the policy of London in these circumstances was aimed at the Mediterranean, where England defended already won positions in Egypt and generally in the Arab countries, as well as in Cyprus, Malta, Gibraltar. It was supposed to seize new positions in Libya, Syria, Greece, Yugoslavia. That is why Great Britain sought to direct the Anglo-American offensive toward this military theatre. But with regard to fighting France, the behaviour of the government of Washington was determined by where the landing would take place, in France or in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. In the first case, the assistance of the French resistance to the unfolding battles would be needed immediately. And it was known, at this point, doubted only for appearance, that General de Gaulle will be able to take certain actions. So it is impossible to bypass him, but in the second option, the case would be reduced to the plan that the State Department has nurtured since 1904. To establish themselves in North Africa, getting the assistance of local authorities, and keeping de Gaulle outside the scope of the operation. We had to make sure that our American allies applied both options to us in turn. By the end of May 1942, they were leaning toward rapprochement with us. On May 21, John Wynant, their worthy ambassador in London, consulted me formally on the prospects for offensive operations across the Channel, on the part we could play directly in these operations, and on the relations which would therefore be established between the French National Committee and the Allied governments. On June 1, at the ambassador's request, our second meeting took place. This time in the presence of Eden, as the British considered it desirable for them to participate in these conversations. On June 29, Eden spoke to me privately on the question of recognition, and as a mediator brought to my attention the formula put forward by the government of Washington. The next day I had a new conversation with Wynant, to which I invited Pleven. At the same time, Churchill, who was in Washington to consult on strategic matters, endeavoured to induce the President to come to some arrangement with me. All this led to a memorandum from the State Department to me on July 9, the wording of which had been agreed upon with me in advance. This document, the preamble of which stated that General de Gaulle has read this memorandum with satisfaction, declared that the United States government and the French National Committee are already closely cooperating in certain fields. Further, that in order to make this cooperation more effective, the United States government has appointed Admiral Stark as its representative to consult with the French National Committee on all matters relating to the conduct of the war. That the United States government recognizes that the French National Committee is to be consulted on all matters relating to the conduct of the war, and that the United States government recognizes that the United States government is not a member of the French National Committee. 4 days later, the British issued a declaration declaring that the basis of Anglo-French relations had been broadened, agreeing that henceforth the movement of the Free French should henceforth be called Fighting France. The English government recognized on July 13 that Fighting France was a union of French citizens, wherever they may be, and of French territories, who unite together to cooperate with European nations in war against common enemies, and that the French National Committee represents the interests of these Frenchmen and these territories before the government of the United Kingdom. These words could only have had the meaning that the English declaration contained, at least on the English side, an assurance that I would not be hindered in the exercise of power in those parts of France and her overseas possessions which would resume the struggle. Other speeches and démarches followed, indicating that the attitude of the Allies towards us had become more favourable. On July 14, when I made a review of the French military units in London, I could ascertain that General Eisenhower and Admiral Stark were present at the parade. On the same day, Eden, addressing the French people by radio on the occasion of their national holiday, declared, "I speak to you not merely as friends, but as allies. Thanks to General de Gaulle's decision, France has never left the battlefield. England has watched with hope and admiration the growing resistance of the French people. For us, the restoration of France, its greatness and independence is not only a promising hope, but also a necessity, for without it, it would be vain to try to rebuild Europe." On July 23, General Marshall and Admiral King, again visiting London, this time wished to meet me. The meeting was attended by Arnold, Eisenhower, and Stark. During our conversation, I acquainted the American leaders with our point of view on the opening of a second front, indicating what France could contribute both internally and externally. Finally, I spoke of the conditions to which the Allies must agree in order that useful cooperation might be established between us. I was naturally in favour of direct offensive operations in Europe, undertaken from Great Britain. No other operation could solve the matter. Besides, the best option for France would be one that would help end the ordeal of occupation and hasten national unification, in other words, to move the battle to the metropolis. Of course, Vichy would continue to recognize the power of the Germans, but the Vichyists would in doing so have lost any vestiges of credibility. Of course, the invader would occupy the free zone, but the situation would become unambiguously clear and the African army, and perhaps the navy, would resume the fight, while in France itself, many would move to the side of the resistance. An opportunity would arise to unite the various French institutions into a single central authority, to prevent a coup at home, and to secure beyond its borders an authoritative representation of French interests. All this, of course, provided that the Allied forces were not thrown into the sea. In exchanges with Churchill, Eden, Winant, Marshall, and others, I roughly calculated what forces I thought were necessary to accomplish the landing. I stated orally and in writing, have in France, according to our network, about 25, 26, or 27 divisions, a number that varies at different periods. They can recruit about 15 more divisions in Germany. Thus, by the beginning of the operation, the Allies will have to deal with about 40 divisions of the enemy. Given the inexperience of a large part of the British and American army and the advantages of the enemy, which has the ability to strengthen the territory he occupies, it is necessary to have at least 50 divisions, including 6 or 7 tank divisions to begin with. In addition, an overwhelming air superiority must be secured. If the offensive unfolds during this fall, the Germans, whose main forces will then be drawn into the fight on the Russian front, can only with great difficulty to transfer from there some units. Moreover, the interaction of the Allied air forces and the French resistance on enemy communications, according to the Gruen plan developed by the Fighting France, will seriously hamper the transfer of German reserves and equipment on French territory. I told the Allied leaders that we, the Free French, can put as a vanguard of 1 division transferred from the east, 1 combined brigade from Equatorial Africa, teams of paratroopers and parachutists, 4 air groups, all the military and cargo ships at our disposal. I personally gave instructions at the beginning of July to keep all these forces ready in case of their possible transfer. In addition, I foresaw that when the pre-bridge fortification in France, our forces could be replenished there with the resources of a small piece of liberated territory. I considered it probable that the 8 divisions and 15 air groups to be formed in North and West Africa, as well as the considerable number of ships enforced in activity at Toulon, Alexandria, Bizerte, Casablanca, Dakar, Fort de France, would be able and willing, after the few weeks necessary to restore them to fighting capacity, to take part in the second landing to be made on the French Mediterranean coast, and finally, as the Allies advance through French territory, a third echelon of French troops will be formed, the nucleus of which will be composed of units of the Secret Army. On July 21, I addressed a note to Churchill and General Marshall, brought to the attention of Moscow, regarding the military contribution that France would be able to make in the next stages of the struggle, and specified the amount of arms and military equipment I was requesting from the Allies. Meanwhile, it soon became clear that the British and Americans would not risk a landing in France this year. They aimed at North Africa, excluding, however, our participation in these operations. Many indisputable facts convinced us that the Americans do not want to give Free France the opportunity to engage in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Meanwhile, we maintained secret communications there until the spring of 1941, but since then we have been completely deprived of direct communication with these territories. Not once did our emissaries manage to get there. Not once did messages from there, addressed to us by Colonel Brayac in Tunisia, Louisny in Algeria, Colonel Lelon and Frank Brentano in Morocco, among others, reach us. It was clear that this was being done under direct orders from Washington, but we had received information in a roundabout way as to the action which the United States had taken both in Africa and in Vichy, in the hope of securing some assistance. We knew that Robert Murphy, Consul General in Algiers, was the mastermind behind the special activities carried on in France by the American Embassy, Consulate, and Secret Services. Murphy, a man of ability and determination, who had long revolved in social circles and was apparently inclined to believe that France was the very people he met in the salons, organized a conspiracy in North Africa to aid the landing operations. He also attempted to cause a palace coup in Vichy itself. In this connection, Murphy first gave his support to General de la Laurencie, who, on his return from Paris, hoped to bring the resistance under his aegis in order to press Pétain to join the government. And de Gaulle, they asked him, well, we will amnesty him. At the same time, Murphy was coaxing some officers in Weygand's entourage to involve the latter in a sort of pronunciamento in order to take Laval's place. But since La Laurencie had no supporters and Weygand refused to rise against Pétain, Murphy came into contact with General Giraud, who had escaped from captivity and was eager to resume the struggle. Murphy believed that Giraud is able to lead the African army, for which he need only appear before it in his own person. For my part, I tried to get in touch with General Giraud. As early as May 1942, during a press conference, I spoke of him in the best possible terms. In June and July, some of my correspondents saw him on several occasions and expressed the hope that we could unite. This great military figure, who I respect very much, commanding the 7th Army in 1940, was not able to succeed. Placed at the head of the 9th Army, which was in a state of complete disorder, he was defeated by the enemy and captured before he could do anything. Nevertheless, we believed that given the opportunity to act under different circumstances, he would be able to take revenge for his failures. And such an opportunity presented itself with his magnificent escape from the German fortress. His defection to the resistance was to be, in my opinion, an important event. As I attached great importance to the revival of North Africa as a force in the war, I thought that Giraud could play a great part in attracting this force, and I was prepared to help him to the best of my ability, so long as he did so without any regard to Vichy or abroad. He would then quite naturally lead the reunited French army in the coming battle for liberation. I instructed him to inform him of the prospects open to him. I hoped that he would give me one answer or another and turn to us in a secret way to pay tribute to those who for 2 years had not bowed their banner to the enemy. But nothing of the kind has happened. All my flattering suggestions to General Giraud were met with complete silence. But as he was as verbose in his surroundings as he was reticent about me, I did not fail soon to learn what his actual sentiments were. Other problems existed for him than military ones. If only, he thought, a more or less imposing French force should reappear on the field of battle, all other questions would fall away as unimportant. The whole moral and political side of our national drama seemed to him a matter of secondary importance. He believed that by taking command of the numerically superior force, he would actually gain power by this alone. He had no doubt that his military rank and his authority would secure for him the obedience of all who were and might be mobilized, and the respectful cooperation of the Allied headquarters. From the moment that he, Giraud, took charge of the army, and thereby of the country, he would treat the marshal as a venerable old man who could be released on occasion, but who was entitled to claim only a monument. Rich and Gaulle, he would have only one thing left to do. He would be subordinated to his superior. National unity would thus be restored on the basis of his identification with the military hierarchy. The views held by General Giraud could not but worry me. It was not only that he had a somewhat simplistic conception of the interplay of these two spheres, military and political, and not only that his conception was clearly born of illusions about the legitimate authority which he attributed to himself. I saw it above all as a source of possible internal strife and external encroachment. For the French resistance in its mass would certainly not accept an authority based solely on a warrior's career, however brilliant it might be. On the other hand, Pétain would surely have condemned it. Finally, the Allies would certainly have used the inevitable dependence of this government, devoid of soil, to the evil of France. It is true that General Giraud believed that he could place at the disposal of the coalition a capital advantage. Reports reaching London indicated that Giraud had an original plan of his own. In his opinion, a pre-bridge fortification already existed in reality. This was supposedly the so-called free zone. Let only the British and Americans land there on the agreed day. Giraud himself undertook to provide cover for the Anglo-American landing with the help of the Armistice Army. It was to be led by the same Giraud, and the role of reinforcements was to be played by the cadres of the resistance movement. But this project, from my point of view, had no chance of success. If it was still possible to imagine that some parts of the free zone, in some places, will follow Giroud in spite of orders and curses, which will burst Marshall, it was more than doubtful that with the extreme poverty of their weapons, these scattered islets will be able to resist the onslaught of the Wehrmacht and German airstrikes. In addition, the Allies were unlikely to approve of the plan, which for them too was fraught with the greatest risk. The success of this landing and subsequent operations implied the involvement of air and naval forces on a very impressive scale. So it was necessary to use the numerous and far-flung points on land and ports on the coast. Meanwhile, if the Allies landed in the south without first establishing themselves in North Africa, they would have as bases only Gibraltar and Malta, insignificant in territory, deprived of resources and cut off from the world. And finally, how would the fleet in Toulon behave in this case? It is clear that at the initial moment it would have followed the orders of only Pétain and Darlan and no one else. And in fact it would be worth this fleet to provide some degree of resistance to the Allies, and the whole enterprise became even more problematic. At the end of July, I clearly felt what was going to happen. Although all plans of action were concealed from us in every possible way, it seemed to me highly probable that the Americans would go no further this year than the seizure of North Africa, that the British would willingly accept it, that both Allies would use General Giroud, that I would be kept out of the affair, and that thus these first preparatory stages of liberation, even if they were accompanied by good fortune, would cause us Frenchmen considerable internal complications, which meant that national unity would encounter new obstacles. Under these circumstances, I felt that since the other partners cared only for their own game, it was my duty to play only in the interests of France. I believed that above all, the unity of the France of battle must be strengthened, so that in all vicissitudes it could be a solid foundation for universal harmony. I knew that such a concentration of forces required a rigid and unwavering line of conduct, and I deliberately went about it. To this end, I decided, using the period of interlude, to tour again the territory of the Middle East and Free French Africa, as well as our troops occupied in the East and in the Chad region. Back in May, the Allies strongly opposed this and later discouraged me from this trip, citing the imminent opening of the Second Front. But this time they did not interfere with my trip, which, however, allowed to conclude that the preparation of an operation in which I will not be involved. On the other hand, while taking care to strengthen our internal ties in the remaining overseas possessions and in the remaining parts of the army, I was at the same time endeavouring to speed up the process of uniting all the resistance forces in France. André Philippe arrived from there just at that time, and I appointed him on July 27 as National Commissioner for Internal Affairs, entrusting him with the task of supporting with all the means at our disposal, both material and personnel and propaganda, the mission entrusted to Jean Moulin. At the same time, I placed Jacques Saustil in charge of the Commissariat of Information. I summoned to London the leaders of the Combat, Liberation, and Fran, Tira groups, Frenet, Dastia, Jean-Pierre Lévy, with a view to obtaining the unification of their actions. It was also necessary to hasten the fusion of the paramilitary elements, for which reason I settled on General de Lestrade as the leader of the future secret army. Finally, wishing to give greater weight to our organization, I proposed that a number of prominent men should join us: Vianot, Massigli, General Dastia de la Vigeri, General Coche, and others. It fell to Parsy's lot to establish communication between France and England, so that I could, on my return from Africa and the East, accurately determine the functions of each. I left on August 5, having previously met with Churchill and Eden. Their somewhat embarrassed speeches confirmed that I was not mistaken. They certainly intended to support a plan directly contrary to the agreement that had bound us since June 1940. My companion on the plane bound for Cairo was Averell Harriman, Roosevelt's designated ambassador to Moscow. This diplomat, usually outspoken and talkative, this time seemed weary under the burden of a heavy secret. On the way at Gibraltar, I saw that work was in full swing, and I could not help noticing also the very puzzling behaviour of the local governor, General Macfarlane, who usually held himself quite at ease. All these were clear indications that major events were about to play out in the Mediterranean area without our participation. I arrived at Cairo on August 7. The atmosphere there was as stifling as it was hot. The general mood indicated that the recent failures of the Eighth Army is by no means forgotten. Although Rommel's advance had been suspended for a month and a half, he was in El Alamein, from where his tanks could reach Alexandria in 2 hours. In government circles, in the embassy, in the general staff, everywhere the British anxiously followed the mysterious actions of King Farouk I and many prominent Egyptians, who were apparently ready to join the Axis powers in the event of their victory. It is true that Nahas Pasha, a long-time adversary of the British but reconciled with them to the advantage of both sides, was placed by the King at the head of the government on the urgent recommendation of Sir Miles Lampson, the British ambassador, who happened to be on his way to an audience at the palace guarded by a tank column. Nahas Pasha said to me last year, "You and I have one thing in common. You and I have a majority in our countries, but not power." Now he was in power. But where would his majority be if Italian-German troops paraded through the streets of the capital? As for the British military leaders, General O'Kinlexo remained calm and kept his usual straightforwardness. Air Marshal Tedder was quite in control of himself and was competent in the affairs entrusted to him. But those in less high places seemed for the most part anxious and acrimonious. They expected apparently great changes at the top. They were irritated by the critical speeches in Parliament and in the London press, and were nervous to see the Egyptians holding and speaking out against them in a hostile manner, and at the same time emphatically welcoming only the Free France regiments in the streets and on the movie screens, and, since my arrival in Cairo, saying that de Gaulle would now take command in the east. It is also true that, as if by way of compensation, well-equipped and fresh English units, valiant air squadrons, and select military equipment were arriving in Egypt in increasing numbers, all sent here with a generous hand by the London government in connection with the forthcoming revenge. If the English were possessed of mingled feelings of hope and melancholy, our people were seized with jubilation. Bir Hakeim had elevated them in their own eyes. I was with them on August 8 and 11. Lamina presented his units to me during the splendid inspection of the 1st Light Division. I presented the Liberation Cross to General Koenig and several others, notably Colonel Ami Lakwari. I also inspected the 2nd Light Division under Cazot and Remy's motor mechanized group. All these units were well equipped and raring to fight. Following this, I visited our pilots and parachutists. All these units were a force hardened by the trials they had endured, and I could be sure that nothing would turn them away from me. When I saw battalions, batteries, armoured cars, wagons, mechanized head to toe, marching side by side in the ranks of hardened soldiers of different races, radiant with joy in spite of the scorching August sun, led by officers who were ready in advance to sacrifice everything for glory and for victory, my heart was filled with faith and pride. I felt that a contact was being established between me and them, that we were together in spirit. That is why we all felt a wave of joy rising in us. But as the last ranks of our troops moved away, cold reason took over. I began to think again about those soldiers, sailors, pilots of France, who were forced to fight against the Gaullists and the Allies there by virtue of ridiculous orders. At our representation in Cairo, I had occasion to become acquainted with the numerous French colony in Egypt. Baron Benoit represented France here with dignity. Thanks to him, and also thanks to Baron de Vaux, René Filiol and Georges Gorce, the cultural, religious and economic interests of France were safely guarded here until the moment when the Egyptian government recognizes the French National Committee. The Egyptian press and broadcasting received all necessary material from our representative. Most Frenchmen were morally with me. At the same time, Benoit, to whom we had vigorous support from London, managed to ensure that the administration of the Suez Canal remained French, although the English Maritime Ministry would have been glad to take it over. It was the French who kept the canal running throughout the war, a not inconsiderable and laudable contribution to the Allied effort. For the sea and land communications of the Eastern Theatre, as well as the cargoes destined for Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, all passed through Port Said, while the Germans continuously bombed caravans of ships and locks. I decided to address the canal staff at Ismailia and visited the little room from which Lesseps was superintending the erection of this grand structure, which was proving vital in the present war. I did not confine myself to making speeches to the Free French, explaining their tasks, urging them to action, but at the same time discussed with the British allies the points of disagreement. Churchill was in Cairo. We had breakfast together on August 7. I came here, he told me, to reorganize the command. In the meantime, let's sort out our disputes over Syria. Then I shall go to Moscow. You yourself realize that my journey is of great importance and causes me some anxiety. Indeed, I replied. There are three important subjects in question. The first concerns you alone. As to the second, which has to do with me, and the third, which relates above all to Stalin. Since you are undoubtedly going to inform him that the second front will not open this year, I understand your fears, but you will easily overcome them as soon as you feel that your conscience is at ease. Know this, Churchill muttered. My conscience is a nice girl with whom I will always get along. I could indeed ascertain that England continued to discuss the question of Syria without a shred of conscience. On August 8 I met with Casey, who, though an Australian by birth, was Minister of State in the London government, and in that capacity was responsible for the state of English affairs in the East. He immediately spoke of the urgent necessity of holding elections in the states of the Levant. I immediately acquainted my sympathetic interlocutor with our position. The French National Committee, I told him, has decided that there will be no elections in Syria or Lebanon this year, because the country for which these territories are mandated does not think it necessary to hold a vote at a time when Rommel is standing at the gates of Alexandria. Is there a vote in Egypt, in Iraq and Jordan? Going on the attack. I enumerated to the English Minister of State point by point the reasons for our dissatisfaction with the policy pursued by England contrary to the agreements made. As a conclusion, I told him what I said to many on the same subject. Of course, at this moment in this part of the world you are much stronger than we are. In view of our weakening and in view of the crises which will break out in a number of places, in Madagascar, in North Africa, and the day will come in the metropolis itself, further aggravating the present critical situation of France, you are certainly in a position to compel us to withdraw from the Middle East. But you cannot achieve this goal without arousing feelings of xenophobia among the Arabs, and with regard to the Allies you will simply use the right of the strong. Where would that lead? For you to an ever-increasing weakening of your position in the East, and for us, for the French people, it will be an indelible offence. Casey, displeased with my remarks, frowned and assured me of his good intentions, at the same time hinting that Great Britain had some ultimate responsibility in the area. At any rate, neither on that day nor on August 11, when I saw him again, did he renew his talk of the election. Marshal Smuts, the Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, was also in Cairo at this time. We had a long conversation with him, an eminent and pleasant man, not without some oddities, a hero of the struggle for independence in the Transvaal, who had become the head of the government of His Majesty the King of England's dominion. A drill in the uniform of an English general, he possessed all the qualities required to solve the problems of the present war. The capital of the state he represented, Pretoria, was a highly eccentric spectacle, and his country, where whites and blacks lived side by side without mingling, was the scene of the sharpest racial conflict. Although Smuts was opposed by a fairly strong opposition in the country, he nevertheless enjoyed real influence in the ruling circles of London. This privilege he owed not only to the fact that in the eyes of the British as if embodied the success of their conquest, but also to his friendship with Churchill, whom he had managed to subdue for a few months in the same distant war, and now Churchill himself was trying, taking advantage of the right opportunity, to captivate Smuts. The Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa expressed to me the feeling of respect which he had for battling France. If you, de Gaulle, had not brought Equatorial Africa to your side, I, Smuts, would not have been able to hold my own in South Africa. For it would have been enough for Brazzaville to succumb to the spirit of surrender, as it would have been the turn of the Belgian Congo, and after its fall, the well-known elements in my country who condemn our participation in the war on the side of the British would have undoubtedly gained the upper hand and entered into collaboration with the Axis states. German hegemony would have been established everywhere from Algeria to the Cape of Good Hope. Already, by what you have done in the Lake Chad area and in the Congo, you have done a great service to our coalition. It is important to all of us that your power should now extend to all the overseas possessions of France and, as I hope, soon to France itself. I thanked Marshal Smuts for his kind review of us, noting at the same time that the other allies did not seem to share this opinion in all respects. As proof, I referred to British activity in Syria and Lebanon, and then to events in Madagascar, and finally recalled the impending British and American campaign in North Africa, where they were endeavouring to establish power, but not mine. Smuts agreed that Free France was right to feel hurt. But, he argued, these deplorable phenomena are but transitory episodes. It is characteristic of Americans to always err at first. As soon as they realize their mistake, they know how to draw the proper conclusions. As for the British, there are two different points of view in their political practice. On the one hand, routine, the spirit of which is maintained by chanceries, committees, staffs, and on the other hand, long-range policy, which is embodied at different periods by various statesmen, relying on popular sentiment. At the moment, such a figure is Churchill. The first point of view works against you, but I can assure you that the second favours you, and in the end it will always prevail. We next turn to the practical questions raised by the situation in Madagascar, and Smoot told me that the British were still hoping for a bargain with the Vichy governor there, but that as soon as this illusion was dispelled they would resume operations, interrupted after the capture of Diego Suarez, try to re-establish on the island an administration under their direct authority, and finally hand over power to the French National Committee, i.e. do what he, Smoot, had recommended to them from the first day. He made me understand that in the game which the English were playing towards me, they were saving as a valuable trump card their agreement to subordinate Madagascar at some point to the Lorraine Cross. London will thus obtain a means of compensating us for one or other of the troubles which English policy saves for France elsewhere. In conclusion, Marshal Smuts promised me that the Union of South Africa would under no circumstances agree to France being deprived of Madagascar, but would, on the contrary, urge London to allow General de Gaulle to establish his authority there. I must say that these words were followed by actual facts in Pretoria. On August 12, I left for Beirut. I intended to stay a month in Syria and Lebanon, to put things in order there, to strengthen contacts with government and leadership circles, to raise the spirit of the population, to try to establish in the affairs and in the minds of the predominant rights of France. In this respect, the very reception I received in that country spoke eloquently for itself. In Beirut, where I arrived accompanied by Alfred Nakache, President of the Lebanese Republic, masses of people came from everywhere. We could see the same thing in the Bekaa, in South Lebanon, especially in Cedar and among the Maronite mountaineers, who came in droves to Bekaa and surrounded their patriarch, to whom I paid a visit. I visited the now subdued and loyal Horan, accompanied by General Catrou, then reached Jebel Druz, a territory in every sense volcanic, at Essuada, after a review of the Druze cavalry. I received in the Maison de France the representatives of the local authorities and nobles, and then in the palace the delegates of all the canons, in what amounted to a tumultuous and picturesque mass manifestation. Here, amid a thunder of cheers, the orators assured me of the sympathy of the population, who had not always been so welcoming to the French. Accompanied by Sheikh Tajeddin, President of the Syrian Republic, I entered Damascus, exhibiting a boisterous enthusiasm not often witnessed in that city. The official reception accorded by the head of state and government, the visits of representatives of various official institutions, heads of various religions, and representatives of all walks of life and all branches of activity, enabled me to see that, in comparison with the previous year, the beautiful capital of this young republic presented a picture of a marked consolidation of the country. I proceeded on to Palmyra, where I was welcomed with honour by the Bedouin tribes. Next, the ancient and so new land of the Euphrates. In Azor, as elsewhere, the current situation, political, administrative, economic, was no longer anything like the situation in 1941 as a result of the sad events of those days. Aleppo, a major centre of the north, where the ethnic, religious, and business currents of Asia Minor have mingled for centuries, greeted me with benevolent expressions of attention. The Alawite country, in turn, welcomed me and pledged its loyalty to its traditional friendship with France. But I was most impressed by the fervent welcome accorded me by former President Hashim Bey Atassi and other gracious hosts in the cities of Homs and Hama, which have at all times been considered citadels of Islamist and Syrian suspicion and distrust. On the way back, Tripoli and Batroun gave me signs of stirring confidence. The higher these waves of popular demonstrations rose, the clearer became the responsibilities of France as a mandate power. It was out of the question that she should always bear the burden of territories which did not belong to her, and which she could not appropriate to herself, prevented by the treaties in question. On the other hand, it was clear that the upper classes in Syria and Lebanon, whatever their differences, were united in their will to achieve independence, which, however, France had always undertaken to grant, and which I had personally solemnly promised them. The state of mind expressed all this so sharply that it would have been absurd to resist. Of course, it was necessary to secure France's economic, diplomatic, cultural interests, which had been her patrimony in the Middle East for centuries. But this seemed compatible with the independence of these states. At the same time, we were not going to abolish in one fell swoop the foundations of our power in Damascus and Beirut. Had we done so, the British would have taken our place, citing the dictates of strategy. I, at any rate, believed that I had no right to rescind the mandate, besides the fact that in this affair, as in everything else, I was responsible to my country. France had a certain international responsibility as the holder of the mandate, and we could only rescind it by agreement with those who had given us the mandate, an agreement not really practicable under present obligations. Otherwise, it would simply mean renouncing our rights. That is why we handed over to the governments of Damascus and Beirut those functions which we could give up, given the state of war, at the same time declaring our determination to restore, by elections, the normal foundations of authority as soon as Rommel was discarded. We undertook to carry out, at the earliest opportunity, the international acts by which the regime of independence would be legally formalized. I was unwilling at this moment to renounce the supreme rights of France in Syria and Lebanon, however impatient professional politicians might be in a hurry. We were confident that we would be able to effect the necessary transformation without much upheaval, unless England spoiled our game. But it did. Nokwash was subjected to the inroads of Spears, who openly agitated his opponents and went so far as to threaten the president directly merely on the ground that one or other of his ministers was disliked by the English, or because the president had not personally promoted immediate elections in Lebanon. On the other hand, under pressure from the English, who sought nothing less than the cessation of all exchange with the outside world, Catrou agreed to introduce them into the Franco-Syrian Lebanese grain trading agency. They took advantage of this circumstance to obstruct the activities of the agency and arouse opposition from the ruling circles of Damascus, disregarding our preemptive rights. They took it upon themselves to build a railroad from Haifa to Tripoli and became its owners, since the French authorities had an oil refinery in Tripoli. At the very exit of the oil pipeline belonging to the Iraq Petroleum Company, which made it possible to supply the Levant with gasoline at the expense of that part of the oil that belonged to the French, the British, under all pretexts, began to seek the closure of our enterprise, so that we ourselves and the Levant would be completely dependent on them in this respect. And finally, referring to the financial agreement which I had concluded with them on March 19, 1941, by virtue of which their treasury gave us a part of our funds in the form of an advance. They wished to control their use in Syria and Lebanon, and even the budgets of Damascus and Beirut. In all areas there were daily, ubiquitous and ever-increasing incidents of interference by our allies, and a whole army of uniformed agents was used for this purpose. I decided to protest against this stranglehold, and if we were destined to fail, let everyone know about these offences. Having checked the facts on the spot, I began the campaign by sending a formal protest to Churchill on August 14. From the very beginning of my stay in the French Mandate States of the Levant, I wrote to him, "I have seen with regret that the agreements made between the English government and the French National Committee concerning Syria and Lebanon are being violated here. The constant interference of representatives of the English government is incompatible neither with England's renunciation of political interests in Syria and Lebanon, nor with due respect for the French position, nor with the Mandate regime. Moreover, this interference and the reaction it provokes induce the people of the whole Arab East to think that serious differences are disturbing the good harmony between England and France in battle, who are allies here. I am compelled to ask you to renew the agreements we have made." The Prime Minister received my message during his stay in Moscow. He replied to me on August 23 from Cairo, through which he was on his way to London. "We do not in any way seek to undermine the position of France in the Middle East. We fully recognize that the initiative in the political field must belong to the French authorities. We quite admit that the mandate cannot at present be revoked for technical reasons." But, while paying tribute to the agreements concluded, Churchill, as usual, referred to them only in order to contrast them with the unilateral claims that Britain boasted. Syria and Lebanon form part of the main theatre of operations, and therefore almost every event in this zone directly or indirectly affects our military interests. We are also concerned that the effective implementation of our guaranteed statement of General Quatreau, which proclaimed the independence of these states. In his message, Churchill concluded his message with the following words: Syria and Lebanon are part of the main theatre of operations, and, therefore, almost every event in this area directly or indirectly affects our military interests. We are also concerned that the effective implementation of the statement of General Quatreau, which proclaimed the independence of these states. In his letter to the United States, Churchill said, "We are concerned to ensure that the independence of these states will be effectively implemented." Churchill concluded his message with deliberately banal conciliatory phrases. "I recognize the necessity of the closest cooperation between our representatives in the Levant. Our highest aim is the defeat of the enemy. I knew in advance that on the part of the British this disguised refusal to change their policy was sure to follow. I decided therefore to remove from it the veil of ambiguity with which they tried to cover themselves. Moreover, thinking of the future, I considered it wise to take a position that excluded all compromise. I cannot agree with your conception, from which it follows that the political intervention of the English representatives in the Levant is supposedly compatible with the obligation assumed by the English government to respect the rights of France and its mandate. Moreover, the well-known Franco-English rivalry, generated by the presence of the two forces and the incessant intervention of the English representatives, is disastrous for the military efforts of the United Nations. I urge you to reconsider this urgent and extremely important issue. In this language I was betting not so much on the present day, which gave me too little chance and opportunity for success in the dispute, as on the future, when France might be able to continue the dispute, if only those who spoke in her name would be firm and reject surrender. Especially since the same violations of our rights were being committed at the same time in Madagascar, and tomorrow they could take place in North Africa and even in Paris itself. We could only counter future violations of our rights by fighting back against those that are being committed now. Let them rob us, but why let them do so in silence? That is why I felt it necessary to inform America and Russia, if even their governments, being formally notified, do nothing to bring the English to repentance, the litigation will at least have an international resonance. On August 16, I received a visit from the Consul General of the United States, the most gracious Gwynn, who came to hear the news. He was visibly disturbed. I did not think of reassuring him. On August 24, I invited him in and handed him a note to deliver to his government. The document outlined the nature of the case and the consequences to which it might lead. The next day Gwynn appeared again. He gave me the text of a telegram addressed by Cordell Hall to John Winant, the American ambassador in London, instructing him to put the matter to the British with all certainty. That's exactly what I wanted. The Secretary of State wrote to his ambassador. We are fully aware of the gravity of the situation. The British representative in Beirut appears to be interpreting his mission more expansively than is customary for a foreign diplomatic representative. Take the matter up again with Eden. Our government cannot remain indifferent to a dispute that affects the overall war effort. On the other hand, Cordell Hall instructed Gwynn to thank General de Gaulle for such full information, but since he could not help adding a little venom at the end of the message, he suggested that his ambassador tell General de Gaulle in full candor that the United States, as a nation engaged in a jointly waged war, attaches serious importance that the assurances given to Syria and Lebanon be scrupulously honoured. Meanwhile, de Gaulle in London had outlined to Bogomolov the substance of our differences and notified our delegation in Moscow. The Soviet ambassador appeared before him on September 11 and informed him that his government agreed to help us as far as possible. I was the less inclined to be ceremonious, because I was now fully aware of the decisions of the British and Americans concerning North Africa. It should not be thought that the Allies shared their plans with me. On the contrary, those who were engaged in the preparations kept a sepulchral silence. But if this conspiracy of silence seemed offensive to us, it was, moreover, also useless. For from everywhere, from America, from England and France, news was coming in. A word was already spreading all over the world, while in the East everything was clearly indicative of a campaign in Africa. Passing through Cairo, Churchill appointed General Alexander as Commander-in-Chief and put Montgomery at the head of the Eighth Army. Numerous reinforcements, particularly armoured units, continued to arrive from England. Turd, commander of the Air Force, received a large number of airplanes. All this pointed to the most extensive plans that did not have Europe as their objective. On August 27, I could report to our delegation in London. The United States has decided to land troops in French North Africa. The operation will be carried out in conjunction with the beginning of the British offensive in Egypt. The Americans have secured their support on the ground by capitalizing on the good feelings of our supporters by indoctrinating them as if they, the Anglo-American forces, were acting in concert with us. Marshal Pétain will undoubtedly order an intervention in Africa against the Allies. The Germans will manage to find a pretext to intervene. I added, the Americans first thought they could open a second front in France this year. That's why, needing us, they embarked on the path defined by their memorandum of July 9. Now their plan has changed. From now on, everything became clear. The strategic intentions of the Allies finally defined. As for their political line, it was based on sacred selfishness. That is why I was less inclined than ever to attach importance to the ideological formulas they tried to cover themselves with. Was it possible to take seriously Washington's emphasized sensitivity in claiming that by keeping General de Gaulle at a distance, he was doing so ostensibly to give the French the freedom to choose their government? After all, this same Washington was at the same time maintaining official relations with the Vichy dictatorship and was ready to make a deal with anyone who would open the gates of North Africa to American troops. Was it possible to believe in the sincerity of the statements of London, which, wishing to justify its interference in the affairs of the Levant territory under the jurisdiction of France, spoke of the rights of the Arabs to independence when the British put Gandhi and Nehru behind bars in India, severely punished the supporters of Rashid Ali in Iraq, and dictated to Furuk, the king of Egypt, the composition of his government? Indeed, today, as yesterday, it was necessary to proceed only from the interests of France. Meanwhile, Casey had decided that the time had come to prove himself. However good his intentions, he began to act in such a way that there was nothing to hope for a favourable outcome. On August 9, he proposed to me a frank discussion in order to establish more satisfactory relations for the benefit of both countries. For, he wrote, I have the impression that relations in Syria and Lebanon have reached a critical point. Unfortunately, the English minister found it necessary to add, and I invite you to meet me in Cairo. If this meeting does not take place, I shall be compelled to report to the Prime Minister on the present situation as it appears to me. The expressions to which he resorted in his message compelled me to reply that I was ready to discuss important matters with him, but only in bits, since during the 2 visits which I had the pleasure of paying him in Cairo, we had not been able to reach an agreement. Here again Churchill intervened. On August 31, he telegraphed me from London that he, like myself, considered the situation serious in spite, that he felt the necessity of discussing it with me as soon as possible, that he asked me to hasten my return to London and to inform him what date to expect me. I could only thank the British Prime Minister for the invitation, tell him that I shall of course make the trip at the earliest opportunity, but that the situation does not permit me to leave the Levant at present, repeat to him that I was ready to begin negotiations with Kaisi at Beirut even today. Finally, on September 7, when the tension had reached its breaking point, I handed a memorandum clarifying our claims to Kaisi through Ambassador Ele, who had come to me from Tehran. As the dispute continued, I endeavoured to bring order within the country. I had to ensure that the 2 local governments steadfastly carry out their functions, particularly in the areas of finance and supplies, where things were going badly. On the other hand, we had to inform them of our position on the elections. Alfred Naqash and Sheikh Tajuddin visited me, one on September 2 and the other on September 4. I received them with great pomp. Both showered me with expressions of goodwill. They both felt much more confident in their places, seeing the steadiness of the French authorities, and, putting aside their former hesitations, were ready to take measures which might balance the balance, regularize the work of the grain agency, and restrain speculation. In agreement with them and with General Catrius, I supported the decision taken by the French National Committee to hold new elections only next summer. But then elections must necessarily be held unless the strategic situation became too complicated. During my stay in Beirut, I came into contact with a number of persons, following the Oriental custom that it is both awkward and unseemly to judge and decide without first gathering opinions and paying attention. At the residence of the Pines, where I was staying, there were many visitors. All assured me of their desire to have a government capable of discharging its duties, but everyone professed to be an apostle of one or another kind of particularism, which ever since the dawn of history has been preventing the state from fulfilling its mission. All the conversations confirmed my conviction that Syria and Lebanon, once independent, would not lose anything from the presence of France, but on the contrary, would get. The advantages that France's presence would bring to both countries were undeniable and unquestionable. Whether it was the provision of public services, building works, education, medical services, the assistance of Frenchmen as advisors in the administrative apparatus, in the organs of public education, justice, order, public works, the ties of professional, intellectual kinship between the natives of France and the Syrians and Lebanese. These thousands of threads met the interests and feelings of both sides. In all the chanceries, the building sites, the schools, the hospitals I visited, everyone thought and said that it was necessary to maintain these ties, on whatever basis future political relations between Paris, Damascus, and Beirut might be established. It goes without saying that I also tried to give a fairly strong impetus to the military organization. Most of the purely French units were then in Egypt. We left only a few units in the left. This extreme paucity of available French troops proved, however, that France's authority was not built on the basis of strength. Thus, the special, that is, Syrian and Lebanese, troops were entrusted with the task of directly ensuring the security of these two states. They could have been in danger at any moment. Indeed, in the late summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht was moving toward the foothills of the Caucasus, while the Italian-German armies threatened the Nile Delta. If the enemy wins a victory in one of these theatres of war, the way to Asia Minor will be open to him. That is why we did everything to strengthen numerically and qualitatively the native troops in the Middle East. Syria foundations of the future armies were later fielded 9 infantry battalions, 1 cavalry regiment, 3 groups of partially motorized squadrons, Lebanon, 3 battalions of mounted huntsmen, and 2 artillery groups and 1 tank battalion, sapper and transport units, as well as units of communication troops were common to both countries. The military school at Homs produced a considerable number of graduates each year. True, the command staff of the Special Forces was replenished by a certain number of French officers. But the cadres were also growing at the expense of the Syrian officers, such as Colonels Shihab and Naufal. The military equipment wrested from dens enabled us to give these troops arms and to equip them decently, and the artillery park at Beirut, which had excellent equipment, provided for technical repairs. I had the honor of inspecting the French, Syrian, and Lebanese units that stood guard over the Middle East, with the land forces commanded by General Emblot, the naval forces by Captain Second Rank Cole Bernard, and the air forces by Lieutenant Colonel Jeans. These 25,000 men, undoubtedly devoted to military duty, guarded both states from possible enemy attack, and together with the local gendarmerie could well maintain order in a country where irreconcilable elements had existed side by side for a millennium, in a country occupying a territory equal to 1/3 of France, and whose borders stretched for 2,500 kilometers, a country with neighbors Iraq, Transjordan, Palestine, which were in a state of constant ferment. The fact that the Levant under the French mandate remained quite calm during this period of the war, and was guarded by quite reliable troops, clearly favored the strategic designs of the Allies fighting in Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, relieving their armies of worries about the rear, strengthening the Turks in their determination not to open passage to the Germans, preventing hostile acts on the part of the Arab peoples shaken by the events of this time. Although my trip involved many matters, a number of issues still remained unresolved. I was able to change the atmosphere and achieve shifts that allowed us to buy time. But how to achieve more without giving reinforcements in terms of people or money? Politics is only worth something when it has sufficient means. And in the East, more than anywhere else, it is the balance of power, not arguments, that decides in the end. This point was confirmed to me by a distinguished visitor from America. It was Wendell Weakley. The Republican Party ran him against Roosevelt in the 1940 presidential election. Now the president, wishing to emphasize that the war had brought sacred unity, had instructed his recent rival to get information in all corners of the earth from those who were directly leading the game. Wendell Weakley, traveling to see Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek, wished to pass through the Middle East as well. He arrived on September 10 and stayed with us for 24 hours as my guest. At his request, I outlined to him the conditions which France had to face in the Levant. But Wendell Willkie, though arriving here for the first time, was apparently already quite well acquainted with everything. On his return to Washington, he declared, with that outward conviction which is characteristic of American public opinion, that the friction at Beirut was but an episode in the rivalry between two colonial empires equally repugnant. Regarding my person in a book he published on his arrival in America, he could not resist a Philistine wit that betrayed ill will. Since at Beirut he and I had conversed in the office of the High Commissioner, furnished in the style of the Empire, I had, he said, imitated the manners of Napoleon, since I was wearing white linen clothes. The summer uniform established for French colonial officers. He saw this as a play on grandeur, a one-a Louis Exive. As one of my staff said something about General de Gaulle's mission, Willkie hinted that I, he said, thought of myself as Joan of Arc. And in this respect Roosevelt's rival also appeared to be his rival. At the very moment that I was talking to the President's representative, however, a new event concerning France appeared on the screen of the day. At dawn on September 10, the British resumed their operations in Madagascar, having ascertained that after 5 months of negotiations they could not obtain from Governor-General any serious guarantee, having ascertained that Vichy was capable of ceding the island to the Japanese at any moment, and that the naval government had given orders not to interfere with them in this case, our allies decided to occupy the island themselves. And this time they were going to act without the help of the Free French forces. But still, unlike what happened during the Diego Suarez attacks, we in this case were warned in time. On September 7, Eden, expressing to Pleven and Dijon his government's dissatisfaction with my position in the Middle East, made it clear that some event in Madagascar would require an arrangement. On September 9, inviting our 2 national commissioners to his house, he let them know that English troops were to land at Manjunga on the following day, that his government had a firm intention of recognizing the authority of the French National Committee over Madagascar as soon as hostilities were over, and that it would be desirable for him to enter into negotiations with me as soon as possible as to an agreement on this subject. On September 10, London announced that British armed forces had landed at Manjunga, and that a friendly administration would be established on the island, willing to cooperate fully with the United Nations and to promote the liberation of France. On September 11, Strang told Maurice de Jeune, "It is the thought of the English government that the French National Committee is and should be the friendly administration referred to in the communique. It is up to you alone to put this plan into effect, as we are convinced that we will be able to come to an agreement." I decided to return to London. I had no doubt that I would find the atmosphere there unpleasant, nor did I doubt that it would be advantageous for me, from a certain point of view, to be on sovereign French territory when the American operation began to develop in North Africa, nor was there any doubt that the Madagascar question would be settled slowly, not immediately and not painlessly. But the stakes were such that I could not hesitate. So I sent a message of goodwill to Eden, stating that I have read the report of Pleven and de Jeune, and that, having received his and the Prime Minister's kind invitation, I intend to return at the earliest possible moment. I shall be glad to discuss with you our relations in the Middle East and the principles of the future civil administration of Madagascar, accordingly to what was outlined in my conversation of September 9 with Pleven and de Jeune. On my way to England, I decided to linger for 10 days in Free French Africa. It was necessary there, as in the East, to strengthen the cohesion of fighting France on the eve of events which might bring disorder into our ranks. I intended also to clarify the task of our military forces in the coming great affair. For the first time I was able to fly from Syria to Caen without recourse to the British Air Force. The fact is that Colonel Marmier and his assistant Colonel Vaca managed to restore several French airlines. Between Aleppo and Deir ez-Zor, Damascus and Beirut, between Damascus and Brazzaville, and between Fort Lamy, Bangui, Brazzaville, Pointe-Noire and Douala, for which they used several civilian aircraft returned to France in the Levant, and mainly 8 Lockheeds which they managed to obtain from the United States, in return for which we allowed the Americans to use the base at Pointe-Noire. These lines were maintained by Air France, whose personnel had languished idle for a long time in Argentina and Brazil, and had finally recently joined fighting France. Leaving Damascus on September 13 and travelling 3,000 kilometres without landing. I arrived at Fort Lamy, which proved that it was possible to maintain communication between the Tories and the Atlantic, based exclusively on Free French territories. At Fort Lamy I was met by Leclerc. In anticipation of the resumption of offensive operations in Libya, he was putting his units, the Desert Army, in order. Again, I was to see motorized columns formed of fighting and transport vehicles, armed and equipped for action in the wide open spaces, with crews eager to take part in risky ventures, all ready, at the command of such commanders as in gold Delange, Dio, Massieu, to leave forever Fay Zouar Fada, to fight their way across the rocky and sandy ocean of the desert. I visited a small motorized unit located in the Lake Chad area, which was to rush from here to Zinda. I familiarized myself at Douala, Libreville, Pointe-Noire, Bangui, Brazzaville with the various units of the two brigades, of which one was intended to move on Tananarive, and the other was to reach Cotonou, Abidjan, and Dakar if possible. Colonel Carretier endeavoured to use as expediently as possible what was left of our air force below the equator. Captain second-rank Charrier, with 4 small vessels, a few airplanes and several Coast Guard posts, guarded an extensive stretch of the coast of Cameroon, Gabon, and the lower Congo. Artillery intendant and medical units did wonders in trying to get everything they needed despite the distances and climatic conditions. Everyone looked forward to the day when operations between the Nile Basin and the Atlantic would unfold, and the bombardment of Fort Lamy showed that the enemy was also preparing for that day. September 22. I, in the form of a personal and secret instruction, put before Leclerc the following tasks: to seize the oasis of Fezana, to organize there the administration acting on behalf of France, then from here to go to Tripoli, suppressing the points of Gat and Ghoudames. To begin the operation as soon as the 8th British Army will return Cyrenaica and penetrate into Tripolitania. Leclerc will go to subordinate to Generals Alexander and Montgomery only after connecting with their troops. Then he, under the overall strategic command of these generals, will take part in the battle for Tunisia. In the event that the Vichyists will resist the landing, and with the help of the Germans to start a battle with the Allies, we for our part should knock them out of French territory where possible. Incidentally, our missions, pontoon on the Gold Coast and Adan in Nigeria, provided us in the areas of the Ivory Coast, Upper Volta, to go Dahomey, Nigeria, with useful connections. Therefore, my instructions also instructed Leclerc to send, if necessary, his units to French West Africa, taking Niger as a starting point. Finally, he was to prepare units that could serve as the nucleus of our troops in Madagascar. Not an easy task. But we had no hesitation. The Free French in Africa were a strong enough unit to withstand any challenge. As for the native Africans, they were as loyal as could be. This is true of their monarchs and chiefs, such as the sultans at Oudaya, at Kanima, at Fort Lamy, as the ruler of Oragola at Fort Archambault, Ahmed Bey at Mago, formerly expelled by the Italians from Fezzan, as the chief Mamadou Mbaiki at Bangui, the queen of the Beiti in the Congo, the chief of the Vilis in Pointe-Noire, Prince Felix in Gabon, the paramount chief of the Paraiso in Douala, the king of the Abrans who fled with his entourage from the Ivory Coast to join de Gaulle, and others. This was also true of the intelligent Africans who became figures in local government, the army, commerce, education. Finally, the whole mass of ordinary people, or farmers, soldiers, labourers, service personnel, also sympathised with the cause of fighting France and felt it necessary to bear their share of the sacrifices. But at the same time, the hearts of Africans were filled with a thrill of hope and faith in the right of man to be free. The drama that had shaken the world, the element of the miraculous that was part of the Gaullist epic that was unfolding on their own continent, the picture of a war that demanded strenuous effort, that changed the very conditions of their existence. All this could not fail to reverberate in huts and nomads, on the savannah and in the forests, in the desert and on the banks of rivers. Millions of black people, who had languished for millennia under the yoke of poverty, were now raising their heads and contemplating their destiny. Governor-General Eboué endeavoured to guide this movement from the very depths. As a convinced humanist, Eboué considered this trend beneficial, since it was intended to raise the present level of existence of these peoples, but as a major administrator he believed that the French authorities should benefit from it. He by no means shrank from the necessity of the moral, political, economic changes which were beginning to permeate this impenetrable continent, but he wanted it to be a special African revolution, so that all the changes in manners, everyday life, laws, not only did not destroy the orders established by the ancestors, but, on the contrary, were made without going beyond the local customs and regulations. This way, according to Ebu, would lead to progress in Africa, to the strengthening and spreading of French influence, to the race's rapprochement. He himself, as head of the administration, encouraged his staff to act in this direction. He gave appropriate instructions on the administration of the territories, as well as on the labour conditions of the native population, on justice, police and taxes. I took advantage of my stay in Brazzaville to congratulate him on his success. Our views coincided. In this sphere, as in many others, the unity of fighting France seemed firmly cemented. September 25th, I arrive in London. The picture changes. The displays of loyalty, the troops raring to fight, the enthusiasm of the crowds, all that yesterday surrounded and encouraged me, have remained on that distant mainland. Once again I feel the burden of what is called power without the contacts and solidarity that ease the burden. Here everything comes down to unforgiving deeds, to hard negotiations. One must choose either conflicts with people or political conflict. And all of this I have to endure in a friendly but foreign country, where everyone is pursuing their own goals, where they speak a foreign language, and where I feel at every turn how little we, with our meagre resources, matter in the big game being played. As might have been expected, negotiations with the English government were resumed in a tense atmosphere. On September 29 I went, accompanied by Pleven, to Downing Street, where Churchill and Eden were waiting for us. It was not difficult to foresee that the English ministers would give vent to their irritation at the events in the Levant. We were inclined to reply in the same way. It was conceivable that the conversation should then end in practical agreements. In particular, a solution to the problem of Madagascar should have been outlined at least in general terms. But in reality, the conversation gradually took a very sharp character, and the tone was set by the Prime Minister himself. True, Churchill, at the beginning of the conversation, thanked me for accepting his invitation and coming to London. I listened to his kind words with the same humour that he himself put in their meaning. After which the English Prime Minister reviewed with me our mutual grievances concerning the East. He stated that the English government had demanded that elections should be held in Syria and Lebanon in the same year, to which I was compelled to reply that this would not be done. Churchill concluded the mutual exchange of sharp words by assuring me that in the field of French-English cooperation in the Levant no agreement with me was conceivable. "We will take that into consideration," he said. To this I made no objection. Then he turned to the question of Madagascar, but only to say, given the state of affairs in Damascus and Beirut, we are in no hurry at all to make Tananarive a new arena of cooperation with you. I see no reason for us to establish a Degolese command there. I met this statement with great disapproval, which evidently contained both England's renunciation of her obligation and her intention to enter into a bargain, which was certainly disadvantageous to us. Pleven, for his part, did not conceal his feelings either. Then Churchill fell upon me in a very sharp and elevated tone. When I allowed myself to remark that the fact of establishing in Madagascar an administration controlled by the British would be an infringement of the rights of France, he shouted with fury, "You say you are France. You are not France. I do not recognize you as France. I do not recognize that I am dealing with France in your person." And he continued to rage, "France. Where is it? I recognize, of course, that General de Gaulle and his followers represent a considerable and respected part of the French people. But surely it is possible to find a power of no less value besides—" I interrupted him. "If, in your opinion, I am not the representative of France, then why and by what right do you discuss with me matters relating to France's international interests?" Churchill remained silent. Here Eden intervened and directed our discussion to the question of the Levant. He pointed out once more on what grounds England felt herself entitled to interfere in our affairs in that neighbourhood. Then, also losing his cool, he began in turn to complain bitterly about my behaviour. Churchill even added fire, shouting that my Anglophobic position is explained by the fact that I am guided by considerations of prestige, as well as the desire to personally elevate in the eyes of the French. I explained these invectives of the English ministers by the fact that they were trying to put forward claims which, for better or worse, were intended to justify the fact that fighting France was going to be kept out of French North Africa. I said this to them both in no uncertain terms. The conversation had evidently reached such a pitch that there was no point in continuing it. All the participants agreed, so we parted. In the days and weeks that followed this conversation, the atmosphere was more than tense. We were surrounded by ill will, The British did not even hesitate to delay for 11 days the dispatch of our telegrams from London, which the French National Committee addressed to the French authorities in Africa, the Levant, and the Pacific. The French National Office concentrated its pressure on Maurice de Jean and wielded the break-up scarecrow so insistently, the ultimate way of intimidating diplomats, that Maurice de Jean, impressed by all this, suggested that we consider what concessions we could make to restore good relations. Concessions. But I didn't want any concessions. Then de Jean left his post. He took this step with great dignity, and a few weeks later became our representative to the emigrant governments in Great Britain. Cleven handed over the conduct of the finances to Dythelm, and temporarily assumed the post of Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, pending the arrival of Massigli, whom I had summoned from France. In the meantime, as is usual, the storm soon subsided. London radio again agreed to transmit our telegrams. Churchill, on October 23, sent me his Chief of Staff Morton, who congratulated me on behalf of the Prime Minister on the feat of the crew of the French submarine Junon, who let down 2 large enemy ships off the coast of Norway. I was also thanked on behalf of the British government for the important contribution which our military forces had made, without sparing themselves, to the Allied operations at El Alamein. And lastly, Churchill asked me to be assured that the best feelings which he had always entertained for me remained unchanged. On October 30, Marshal Smoot, who had arrived in London, having met me at his request, informed me that the British were prepared to recognise the authority of fighting France at Tananarive. He added that the same would be done sooner or later with regard to North Africa. A few days before, the Foreign Office had actually ventured to enter into negotiations with us to conclude an agreement about Madagascar. It was first suggested to us that, with the introduction of our local administration, the British command should be given a right of some control over it, and that, in addition, the British should have full possession of all the bases, communications, and means of communication available on that island. We rejected these claims. We believed that the French should enjoy sovereign political and administrative power in Madagascar. As to the necessary defence of the island, we proposed that the strategic direction of operations against the common enemy should rest with the highest English officer, as long as the British had greater capabilities there than we did. Should the relationship of forces change, the leadership should pass to the French. In the meantime, the French authorities will give our allies, according to their needs, the assistance of our institutions and our various services. I have appointed General Lejonthiome as High Commissioner for the Indian Ocean area with the widest civil and military powers. At the same time, I decided to appoint Pierre de Saint-Ima, then Governor-General of Ubangi, as Governor-General of Madagascar. Both were to go to their destination as soon as the operations on that large island were over, and as soon as our own negotiations with the English had actually made it possible for both to perform their functions. The English government soon announced that they accepted our proposal in the main points. It must be said that, as the Vichy government was losing real influence in Madagascar, the English became convinced that the inhabitants of Madagascar, the natives as well as the French, were expressing an almost unanimous desire to join General de Gaulle. If the London cabinet delayed a decision, it did so with the express intention of offering it to us in compensation at the time of the Allied landings in Algiers and Casablanca, which, it was not difficult to foresee, would have a negative effect on our relations. That is why, when, on November 6, the day after the armistice in Madagascar, Eden, showering me with courtesies, suggested that I publish a joint communique of the British government and the French National Committee on the imminent departure of General Lejonthiome to the island, I concluded that events in North Africa would not be long in coming. This was apparently the opinion of other persons who endeavoured to give us special marks of attention. Thus, on August 6, while I was on my way to the east, President Benesch solemnly declared to Maurice Jean that he regarded the French National Committee, led by General de Gaulle, as the true government of France. He asked the Commissioner for Foreign Affairs to inquire of me whether we did not think that the moment had come when it would be proper to condemn publicly, on behalf of France, the Munich agreements and all the damage they had done to Czechoslovakia. I replied in a favourable spirit. On my return I met Benesch, and we had no difficulty in coming to an agreement. An exchange of letters between myself and Monsignor Sramek, President of the Czechoslovak Council of Ministers, followed on September 29. The State National Committee, rejecting the Munich agreements, solemnly declares that it considers these agreements null and void, and that we shall do everything in our power to ensure that the Czechoslovak Republic, in its pre-September 1938 borders, receives a full and valid guarantee of its security, its integrity and its unity. In Monsignor Sramek's reply, the Czechoslovak government pledged to do everything possible on its part to ensure that France regains its power, its independence and the integrity of its metropolitan territories and overseas possessions. The next day, in my radio address, I publicized these mutual pledges and emphasized their moral and political significance. From Moscow, we also received encouraging signs. The Soviet government, knowing what the Anglo-Saxons were about to undertake in North Africa, seeing what position the United States was taking toward us, considering, on the basis of Litvinov's reports from Washington, Roosevelt's intention to become an arbiter between the various French factions, was seriously worried in the face of this American tendency toward hegemony. Bogomolov made it clear to me on behalf of his government that Russia, fighting not for life but for death with the invader, could not at the moment intervene directly, but that this did not prevent Russia from condemning this policy of the Anglo-Saxons and that, in she would be able to resist it. On September 28, Moscow stated in a widely circulated communique that the Soviet Union recognized France in battle as the totality of French citizens and territories who by all means at their disposal contribute, wherever they may be, to the liberation of France, and recognized the French National Committee as the governing body of France in battle, and the only body with the right to organize the participation in the war of French citizens and French territories. In Russia's view, there is no room for the existence of any third force, or any third authority between Vichy and fighting France. It must be said that while America, the new star on the stage of world history, could still believe that it was capable of ruling the French nation, the European states, which had centuries of experience, had no such illusions. Besides, France had already made its own choice. Everyday news came from there that the resistance movement was growing continuously, which meant that all those involved were morally aligned with General de Gaulle, and that any government created without him would have been rejected by the masses on the first day of liberation. This evolution, however, was facilitated by the behavior of both the occupiers and those who collaborated with them in France. On June 22, Levail, to the indignation of all, declare. In July, a certain legion formed of young Frenchmen was sent to Russia at the behest of the Germans and wearing German uniforms. In August, Pétain issued a law declaring that all activity of the bureaus of the two chambers, which still existed for appearance's sake, was henceforth to cease. So the parliamentary figures were now cursing the regime they themselves had established. Jeannin, President of the Senate, and Herriot, President of the Chamber of Deputies, made an open protest to Marshal Pétain. Herriot returned his cross of the Legion of Honor as a sign that he condemned the rewarding of volunteers who were fighting against the Russians, for which Herriot was soon arrested, while Paul, Reynaud, Daladier, Blum, Mandel, General Gamelin, and others were already in the prisons into which Vichy had thrown them the day after Pétain came to power. And not only were they not condemned by any court, but they were not even charged in the usual way. During the summer, the persecution of the Jews, carried out by a special commissariat in agreement with the invaders, intensified in September because the Nazis insisted on sending more and more labor to Germany, and there was a shortage of voluntary workers. A massive forced recruitment of workers was undertaken. The total cost of maintaining the occupiers reached 200 billion at the beginning of September, more than doubling compared to September of the previous year. Finally, the German occupiers sharply intensified repression. During that month, 1,000 people were shot, 116 of them on Mont Valérien. More than 6,000 were sent to prisons or concentration camps. When I returned from the Levant and Africa, there were such witnesses and testimonies waiting for me in London that no one could refute. The head of the combat group, Freinet, the head of the liberation group, Dastier, made me a report on the activities in the unoccupied zone. Their reports vividly showed the ardent desire of their organizations for unity, which was also prompted by pressure from below. At the same time, they pointed to extreme individualism on the part of the leaders of the organizations, which led to rivalry. When the arrivals saw the hindrances of the Allies, which were not even suspected in France, and when they learned in particular what events were being prepared in Algeria and Morocco, they realized even more clearly the need for cohesion within France itself. In my instructions to them, I proposed to speed up the creation of a National Council of Resistance, which would include representatives of all branches of the movement, trade unions and parties, headed by Jean Moulin. Moreover, I insisted that they should not hesitate to incorporate their existing fighting units into the secret army, then being created. These men would be subordinated in each area to a single leadership, a military delegate appointed by me. As for the occupied zone, I instructed Remy to transmit the same directives to the following movements: OSMC de la Libération, C de la Résistance, Libération Nord, Verbe du Nord, and even the organization Frontiera et Partisan, which was led by communists and wanted to contact us. Of course, we did not forget to pass on to London and Washington the information that came to us from France. Frenette and Dastier were connected with English ministers and services, as well as with American diplomats and informers. André Philip went to Washington armed with documents and evidence, having also been instructed to deliver to Roosevelt a letter from General de Gaulle covering the general situation and the actual state of affairs in France. Indus France, who had fled France, travelled to Washington to enlighten the unenlightened. Félix Gouin, who arrived in August with a mandate from the Socialists, informed the Labour Party that the French Socialists were joining the Cross of Lorraine. Following this, Brossolette arrived from the occupied zone and with him Charles Vallin, the hope of the former right and the League of the Fighting Crosses. Vallin, recently an adherent of the Vichy regime, was now renouncing his delusion. This ardent patriot, this apostle of tradition, joined me wholeheartedly. He acquainted public opinion with the reasons which had prompted him to this act, then entered the ranks as company commander. General Dastier de la Vigérie, General Cochet, the distinguished leaders of the Air Force, also joined us. The communists were not far behind. From France they decided to send Fernand Grenier to us, while in Moscow André Marty met repeatedly with our delegate Garrod and asked to be informed through him that he was placing himself at my disposal. Finally, people of all kinds, such as Mandel, Jout, Leon Blum, then still prisoners of Vichy, as well as Giannite Marin, Jacquinot, Dautry, Louis Gillet and others, informed us of their views and of their joining me. In this way the resistance became more and more united against all the difficulties, against the dangers and losses of the struggle in France, against the rivalries of the leaders, against the separatist actions of certain groups in the service of the foreigners. I was able to help to galvanize and direct this movement, and thanks to this I obtained at the right moment a valuable instrument in the struggle against the enemy, and in the face of the Allies an essential support for my policy of independence and unity. And now the first days of November 1942 are upon us. America was about to open her crusade westward and send her ships, her troops, her squadrons to Africa. Beginning on October 18th, the British, with the help of French troops, begin to expel the Germans and Italians from Libya in order to join later in Tunisia with the American and perhaps French army far away on the Volga and in the foothills of the Caucasus. Russian might is exsanguinating the enemy. What prospects henceforth open to France? How clear and simple everything would be for her suffering sons, if it were not for the demons of fierce internal strife, and if it were not for the evil spirit which inspires abroad the idea of taking advantage of these strifes. It is not without anxiety that I wait for the new act of the drama to begin, but I have confidence in my men. I know to whom the eyes of France are turned. Let the curtain rise again.